Get the fuck out of my way, you worthless piece of shit. Those words cut through the smoke and screaming like a blade. I was suspended 40 feet above the ground, rappelling down the side of a crumbling apartment building in Brooklyn, when I heard them. Below me, through the shattered window of the third floor, a man in a business suit was shoving past a terrified elderly woman, knocking her to the ground as concrete chunks rained from the ceiling. The building had been struck by a gas explosion 2 hours earlier. Half the structure had already collapsed. What remained was a death trap, groaning and swaying with every gust of wind. I swung through that window like my life depended on it, because theirs did. The man was bleeding from his forehead, his expensive tie torn, his polished shoes slipping on debris as he clawed toward the stairwell that no longer existed. The woman, maybe 70, maybe older, lay crumpled near the wall, her flowered house dress covered in dust, her glasses cracked. She was whimpering in a language I didn't recognize, but fear needs no translation. The man didn't even look back. He was already gone, disappearing into the smoke toward a hallway that led nowhere. In that moment, suspended between heaven and hell, I made a choice that would haunt me for years. Not because it was wrong, but because of what it would cost me. The building shuddered, a deep, bone-rattling groan that meant we had maybe minutes before the entire floor pancaked. I could save one person, maybe two if I was fast enough and lucky as hell, but I couldn't save them all. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, I knew that the man in the suit, the one who'd pushed past a grandmother like she was garbage, would be the one I'd carry out into the light, kicking and screaming, while she died alone in the dark. I'd come to check on my niece. My brother Marcus had called that morning, voice tight with barely controlled panic. Sarah's in that building, third floor, the one that collapsed on Flatbush. I can't get through to her. Sarah was 19, studying art therapy at Brooklyn College, living in her first apartment with 2 roommates and a rescue cat named Picasso. She was supposed to have been at class when the gas main ruptured, when the explosion tore through the building's foundation like God's own sledgehammer. But she'd stayed home sick that day, curled up with tea and textbooks, completely unaware that her uncle had been moonlighting as a private consultant for the city's emergency response team for the past 3 years. What my family never knew, what they'd never bothered to ask about, was that I'd been secretly working with FDNY on high-risk rescue operations since I'd left the department 5 years earlier. The official story was that I'd burned out, couldn't handle the pressure, had taken a cushy job teaching CPR to soccer moms in suburban community centers. The truth was that after 17 years of walking into burning buildings, after watching too many good people die because we arrived 30 seconds too late, I developed what the department psychologist called survivor's complex. I couldn't stop saving people, so they let me consult on the cases that were too dangerous, too unstable, too fucked up for regular protocol. The rope burned through my gloves as I rappelled deeper into what remained of the building. 3 floors had pancaked into one twisted mess of steel and concrete, but somehow this pocket of the 3rd floor remained intact, a bubble of space in a mountain of debris. The elderly woman wasn't moving. Blood trickled from her temple, and her breathing was shallow, labored. I checked her pulse, weak but steady. Then I heard it, a voice calling from somewhere deeper in the wreckage. "Help! Please, somebody help me." Sarah. I'd recognize that voice anywhere, even filtered through smoke and terror. She was trapped somewhere beyond the collapsed hallway, probably in her bedroom at the back of the apartment. The route was blocked by a massive concrete slab that had fallen at an angle, creating a crawl space barely wide enough for a person. Going in there would be suicide. One wrong move, one shifted beam, and the whole thing would come down. I looked at the grandmother, then toward the sound of my niece's voice. The building groaned again, metal screaming against metal. I had maybe 5 minutes before the floor gave way completely. The math was brutal. I could carry the unconscious woman to safety and come back for Sarah, but there wouldn't be time. Or I could crawl through that death trap to reach my niece and pray the old woman would somehow survive until backup arrived. I made the choice that would define the next 5 years of my life. I kissed the grandmother's forehead and whispered, "I'm coming back for you, I promise." Then I army crawled into that concrete coffin, following the sound of Sarah's voice deeper into the belly of a dying building. The space was so tight I had to remove my oxygen tank and push it ahead of me. Rebar scraped against my back, tearing through my protective gear. With each inch forward, the weight above me seemed to press down harder, like the building itself was trying to crush me for my audacity. But I could hear Sarah more clearly now. She was crying, calling my name. She'd recognized my voice through the radio chatter. Uncle Danny? Uncle Danny, is that you? I'm here, baby. I'm coming. When I finally reached her, she was pinned under a fallen bookshelf in what had been her bedroom. Conscious, alert, scared out of her mind, but alive. I worked frantically to lift the shelf, my muscles screaming, sweat mixing with blood from a dozen small cuts. The moment she was free, we heard it, a sound like the earth itself splitting open. The building was coming down. We made it out with 17 seconds to spare. I threw Sarah through the window first, into the safety net below, then dove after her as the floor collapsed completely behind us. We hit the net hard, bounced twice, and rolled onto the street. Sarah was crying, clutching my jacket. The crowd of firefighters and paramedics who'd gathered below erupted in cheers. But I wasn't celebrating. I was staring up at the third floor, now completely buried under tons of concrete and steel, knowing that somewhere in that tomb lay an elderly woman who'd died alone because I'd chosen blood over duty. They called me a hero. The New York Post ran my photo on the front page. Tunnel rat saves niece from death trap. The mayor gave me a medal. The governor signed a check for $280, Orzo Zero from the state's emergency responder fund. There was talk of a documentary, a book deal, speaking engagements, but every time someone shook my hand and called me brave, I saw her face. Mrs. Chen, I learned later. 82 years old, grandmother of 7, who'd lived in that apartment for 30 years, and died because I'd made the choice that felt human instead of heroic. The department psychiatrist said I was experiencing moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from being forced to act against your deepest values. In layman's terms, I was fucked up. I couldn't sleep without seeing her broken glasses. I couldn't eat without tasting smoke. I couldn't look at Sarah without feeling grateful and guilty in equal measure. So I quit. Not dramatically, not with some grand speech about the weight of impossible choices. I just stopped showing up to the consulting gigs, stopped returning calls from the department, packed my apartment in Queens and moved to a studio in Manhattan where nobody knew my name or my story. I took a job teaching basic first aid and emergency preparedness at community centers throughout the 5 boroughs. Kids, mostly. Teenagers who'd never seen real fire, never had to choose who lives and who dies. My family thought I'd lost my mind. "You're wasting your talent," my mother said during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "Marcus says you could write your own ticket with any fire department in the country. Why are you teaching finger painting and campfire songs?" I never corrected her, never told her I wasn't teaching arts and crafts, but how to stop arterial bleeding with a belt and a pen, how to signal for help when your phone is dead and you're trapped under debris, how to stay calm when the world is ending around you. Small skills that might save lives someday, when the next building comes down. Marcus was the crown jewel of our family. Dr. Marcus Rivera, chief of cardiology at Mount Sinai, featured on the cover of New York Magazine as one of the city's most eligible bachelors. Brilliant, charming, successful in every way that mattered to our parents. He drove a Tesla, lived in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, and dated women who looked like they'd stepped out of magazines. When he spoke, people listened. When I spoke, people smiled politely and changed the subject. The difference between us had been carved in stone years ago. Marcus had gone to Harvard Medical School on a full scholarship, graduated summa cum laude, completed his residency at Johns Hopkins. I'd gone to community college for 2 years, then straight into the fire academy. He saved lives with precision and technique. I'd saved them with rope and adrenaline and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness. But in our family's math, only one of those approaches counted as success. The text message came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was running a CPR training session for high school seniors in the Bronx. Family dinner Saturday, celebrating Marcus's promotion to department head. Dress appropriately. No work stories. It was from my mother, sent to the family group chat that I rarely participated in. Below it, my father had added a thumbs-up emoji. Marcus had responded with a gif of champagne bottles popping. I stared at the screen for a long moment, watching my students practice chest compressions on rubber dummies. These kids understood urgency, understood that sometimes seconds mattered more than style points. They didn't care that I lived in a studio apartment or drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic. They cared that I might teach them something that would matter when everything went wrong. But I replied anyway, I'll be there. Because family is family, even when family treats you like a stranger who happens to share their last name. Even when you know that your presence is tolerated rather than celebrated. Even when you suspect that the real reason for these gatherings isn't love, but some twisted need to measure success by proximity to failure. That night, I opened the fireproof safe I kept under my bed and pulled out the envelope I'd never opened. Inside was the check from the state, still crisp and untouched after 3 years. $280,000, enough to buy a real apartment, start a real business, maybe even fund the kind of emergency preparedness program I dreamed about but never had the capital to launch. But touching that money felt like cashing in on Mrs. Chen's death, like admitting that her life had been worth a dollar amount. So it sat there, untouched and untouchable, a reminder of the choice I'd made and the price she'd paid. Tomorrow I'd put on my best clothes and sit through another dinner where my achievements were footnotes, and my failures were the unspoken subtext of every conversation. I'd smile when Marcus told his stories about saving lives, knowing that the lives I'd saved had come at a cost I was still paying. But tonight, in my small apartment filled with the tools and textbooks of a trade nobody understood, I was exactly where I needed to be, teaching kids how to survive, one lesson at a time, in a world that seemed determined to bury us all. The restaurant was one of those Manhattan establishments where the waitstaff spoke in whispers, and the wine list required a small mortgage. Le Bernardin, because nothing said, celebrating Marcus like a 4-star temple to excess. I arrived exactly on time, wearing my best dress, navy blue, purchased specifically for occasions when I needed to look like someone's respectable daughter, and shoes that pinched my feet in ways that reminded me why I preferred steel-toed boots. The Rivera family table was positioned prominently in the center of the main dining room, as if we were performing dinner theater for an audience of fellow diners who probably thought we looked like the picture of success. My parents glowed under the soft lighting, Dad in his best suit, Mom wearing the pearl necklace she reserved for important occasions. Marcus held court at the head of the table, accepting congratulations from a rotating cast of colleagues, friends, and family members who'd driven in from New Jersey for the celebration. I was seated at the far end, naturally, next to my cousin Elena, who'd spent the last 10 minutes explaining why her new juice cleanse was literally transforming her relationship with food, and my Uncle Roberto, who kept asking if I'd figured out what I wanted to be when I grew up yet. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was 38 years old, sitting at the kids' table, while my younger brother basked in the attention that came with having doctor in front of his name. So remind me, Elena said, pausing between sips of her $14 green smoothie. What exactly do you do now? I remember you used to be a firefighter, but that was ages ago, right? I run emergency preparedness programs, I replied, cutting my overpriced fish into smaller pieces to make the meal last longer. First aid training, disaster response, survival skills for urban environments. Elena's expression suggested I'd just told her I collected garbage for a living. Oh, like summer camp stuff? More like how to stay alive when infrastructure fails, I said evenly. How to stop someone from bleeding out when an ambulance can't reach you. How to escape a building when the exits are blocked. She blinked, then brightened with the artificial enthusiasm of someone changing an uncomfortable subject. That's really meaningful work, I'm sure, very grassroots. Across the table, Marcus was deep in conversation with his department head, Dr. William Nash, a man whose reputation in New York medical circles was exceeded only by his ego. Nash had been Marcus's mentor throughout his residency, the kind of old-school surgeon who wore his authority like cologne and expected deference from everyone within a 10-foot radius. The new cardiac unit will revolutionize how we approach emergency intervention, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying that practiced cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. We're talking about reducing mortality rates by 20% in the first year alone. Mom leaned forward, hanging on every word like Marcus was delivering the Sermon on the Mount. 20%! Daniel, did you hear that? Your brother is going to save so many lives. I nodded and took another sip of water, wondering if she'd ever shown the same enthusiasm for any life I'd saved. Probably not, since she'd never bothered to ask about them. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Medical terminology, hospital politics, vacation plans to places I couldn't afford. I was present but not participating, visible but not seen. It was a familiar feeling, like wearing a coat that was just slightly too small, noticeable only when you tried to move. Then Dr. Nash's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowned, and showed the screen to Marcus. Emergency at the hospital. I'm sorry, but I need to. Of course, Marcus said quickly. Go. Lives are more important than dinner. Nash stood, gathering his coat, then paused. His eyes swept the table and landed on me with the kind of attention I wasn't used to receiving at these gatherings. He squinted slightly as if trying to place a half-remembered face. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, "but you look incredibly familiar. Have we met before?" The table went quiet. All eyes turned to me, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever I was suddenly the center of attention. "I don't think so," I said carefully. Nash stepped closer, his frown deepening. "No, I'm certain. Your face is—" He stopped mid-sentence, his expression shifting from confusion to something like recognition, then to something like awe. "Jesus Christ. You're her. You're the firefighter from the Brooklyn collapse." My mouth went dry. Around the table, faces shifted from polite interest to genuine confusion. Marcus looked like someone had just told him the earth was flat. "The Flatbush Avenue building," Nash continued, his voice growing stronger with certainty. "3 years ago, you rappelled down from the roof into that death trap. I was trapped on the 3rd floor. Heart attack from the smoke and stress. You carried me out over your shoulder like I weighed nothing." The restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving just this moment, this man, this unwanted spotlight. "Dr. Nash," I said quietly, "you don't need to—" "Like hell I don't," he interrupted, his voice carrying now, drawing attention from nearby tables. "You saved my life. I was unconscious by the time we hit the street. But I remember your voice. You kept talking to me the whole way down, telling me to stay awake, that my granddaughter needed me to get home safe." Around our table, the silence was deafening. Mom's hand was frozen halfway to her wine glass. Dad looked like he was trying to solve a complex math problem in his head. Marcus just stared, his celebration forgotten. Nash turned to address the entire table, his voice warm with the kind of reverence usually reserved for speaking about saints. "Your daughter is a genuine hero. She risked her life to save mine and 7 other people that day. The city gave her the Medal of Honor, highest civilian decoration we have. I heard she got a substantial grant from the state, too, though she's too modest to mention it." He turned back to me, his eyes bright with emotion. "I've thought about you every day for 3 years. I wanted to find you, to thank you properly, but you disappeared from public view after the ceremony. My granddaughter, Jessica, she's 12 now. She asks about you every time she visits. She calls you Grandpa's Angel." The weight of every eye in the restaurant pressed down on me. This was the moment I dreaded and somehow always known would come, when my 2 worlds collided and the careful wall I'd built between my past and present crumbled to dust. Dr. Nash was still talking, still describing the rescue in vivid detail. But all I could hear was the sound of Mrs. Chen's last breath, the memory I'd carried alone for 3 years. "Dr. Nash," I said finally, standing on unsteady legs. "I need some air." I walked out of that restaurant and into the cool Manhattan evening, leaving behind a table full of people who'd just learned that the family failure had been keeping the biggest secret of all. I made it 3 blocks before Marcus caught up with me. I was sitting on a bench in Central Park watching the city lights reflect off the reservoir when I heard his footsteps on the gravel path. He sat beside me without saying anything for a long moment, both of us staring out at the water like it might contain answers to questions we didn't know how to ask. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" he said finally. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Tell you what, that I'd been recognized for doing my job, that I'd received an award for making an impossible choice that haunts me every single day. Danny, you saved 8 people. You're a fucking hero." "I let an old woman die, Marcus. Her name was Mrs. Chen. She was trapped in the same building, conscious and breathing, and I left her there to die so I could save your daughter." The words tumbled out like water through a broken dam. "So forgive me if I don't feel like celebrating." Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "Sarah never told me you saved her. She said it was a team effort, that multiple firefighters were involved. I asked her not to. She was 19 and traumatized. The last thing she needed was to carry the weight of knowing someone died so she could live." "Jesus, Danny, the guilt you must be carrying is mine to carry," I finished. "I made the choice. I live with the consequences. That's how it works." We sat in silence again, watching late-night joggers circle the reservoir. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, Mom and Dad are in the car arguing about whether to come find you or give you space. They're pretty shaken up." They're embarrassed, I corrected. They just learned their failure of a daughter is actually more decorated than their golden boy, and they have no idea how to process that information. Marcus winced. That's not fair. Isn't it? When's the last time either of them asked about my work? Not what I do for money, but what I actually care about? When's the last time they showed up for anything in my life that mattered to me? He didn't answer because we both knew the truth. They'd attended his medical school graduation, his residency completion ceremony, every promotion celebration and awards dinner. They'd never once visited one of my training sessions, never asked to see the letters I got from kids whose lives I'd potentially saved, never showed interest in the program I was quietly building one student at a time. The money, Marcus said eventually. Nash mentioned a grant. Is that $280,000, I said, sitting in a safe under my bed for 3 years because spending it feels like profiting from Mrs. Chen's death. Marcus whistled low. Danny, that could change your whole life. It has changed my life, just not in the way anyone expected. My phone buzzed. A text from Mom. Come home when you're ready. We need to talk. All of us. Below it, a second message. We're proud of you. We always have been. We just didn't know how to show it. I showed the screen to Marcus. He read it and shook his head. Too little? Too late? I don't know. Maybe. Probably. I stood up, brushing off my dress. But I'm going to find out. The ride back to my parents' house in Queens was silent except for the hum of Marcus's Tesla on the highway. I stared out the window at the city lights, thinking about all the calls I'd never made, all the dinners I'd attended as a spectator, all the years I'd spent believing that my worth was measured by their approval. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was lit up like Christmas morning. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mom and Dad sitting at the table, clearly waiting for us. There were boxes on the counter, old photo albums, newspaper clippings, things that had been stored in the basement for years. They've been digging through the archives, Marcus said, following my gaze, looking for articles about you, I think. We walked in together, and Mom stood immediately, her eyes red-rimmed and slightly wild. Daniel, sweetheart, I found the newspaper stories. From the collapse, from other rescues too. Why didn't you keep these? Why didn't you show us? On the table was a spread of clippings I'd never seen. Not just about the Brooklyn collapse, but about other calls I'd responded to over the years. A house fire in the Bronx where I'd carried out a family of 5. A water rescue in Queens where I'd pulled a teenager from an overflowing storm drain. A dozen smaller stories, each one representing a day I'd risked my life for strangers, each one forgotten as soon as the next emergency call came in. I saved these, Dad said quietly. All these years, I saved every article I could find about your work. I was proud, Danny. I didn't know how to say it. I picked up one of the clippings, a small piece from the Queens Chronicle about a car accident where I'd used the jaws of life to extract a trapped driver. The photo showed me in full gear, helmet off, face streaked with sweat and motor oil. I looked exhausted, focused, and completely myself in a way I'd never been in any family photo. I want to understand, Mom said, sitting back down heavily, about Mrs. Chen, about the choice you made, about why you've been carrying this alone. So I told them, all of it, about the impossible mathematics of emergency response, about the weight of choosing who lives and who dies, about the nightmares and the guilt and the check I couldn't bring myself to cash. I told them about the kids I taught, about the letters I got from parents thanking me for giving their teenagers skills that might save their lives someday. I told them about the program I wanted to build, about the lives that could be saved if only I had the resources to reach more people. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Mom crying softly. Dad reached across the table and took my hand, the first time he'd done that since I was a child. What do you need from us? He asked. The question caught me off guard. In all my years of feeling invisible, of feeling like my accomplishments didn't matter, no one in my family had ever asked what I needed. I need you to see me, I said. Not as the daughter who didn't become a doctor, but as the person who chose a different way to save lives. I need you to understand that my work matters, even if it doesn't come with a title or a salary that impresses your friends. We see you, Mom said, her voice thick with tears. We've always seen you. We were so focused on what we thought success looked like that we missed what it actually was. It wasn't an apology, exactly, but it was a beginning. 6 months later, I stood in front of a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, watching as workers installed the sign above the entrance, Chen Emergency Preparedness Center. The name had come to me during one of my sleepless nights, a way to honor the woman whose death had shaped every day since. The $280 $0 grant, finally cashed and carefully invested, had provided the seed money, but it was the additional funding that made the real difference. Marcus had quietly liquidated some of his investment portfolio, Mom and Dad had pulled from their retirement savings, and Dr. Nash had connected me with a network of donors who understood the value of keeping people alive. The center wasn't much to look at from the outside, a simple building in an industrial district, sandwiched between an auto repair shop and a bodega. But inside, it hummed with possibility. Training rooms equipped with the latest CPR dummies and trauma simulation equipment, a mock apartment where we could practice fire evacuations and earthquake responses, a computer lab where kids could learn to coordinate emergency communications when traditional systems failed. My first class was a mix of teenagers from 3 different high schools, kids who'd signed up for what they thought would be an easy elective credit. By the end of the first week, they understood they were learning skills that could save their own lives and the lives of everyone they'd ever love. "Miss Rivera," said Jessica, a 15-year-old from the Bronx who'd initially complained that the class was too much like gym. "My little brother started choking on a piece of candy last night. I did the Heimlich maneuver you taught us. It worked." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. Not the newspaper articles or the official recognition, but the quiet victories that would never make headlines. Lives saved by teenagers who'd learned to keep their heads cool in crisis. Families reunited because someone had remembered how to signal for help when their phone was dead. Small miracles built from simple knowledge, passed from one person to another like a sacred flame. Marcus visited every few weeks, sometimes bringing colleagues who were interested in cross-training between medical emergency response and civilian preparedness. The dynamic between us had shifted in ways that surprised us both. He was still the successful doctor, still the family favorite in many ways, but there was a new respect in how he spoke about my work. More importantly, there was genuine curiosity. "I save people when they reach the hospital," he told a group of his medical school students during one of their visits to the center. "My sister saves people before they need the hospital at all." Mom and Dad had become unexpected advocates, telling anyone who'd listen about their daughter's work. It was awkward at first. They stumbled over the terminology, clearly uncomfortable with admitting they'd been ignorant about something so important to me for so long. But they showed up, to graduations, to fundraising events, to the small ceremonies where we honored students who'd used their training in real emergencies. The hardest conversation came 8 months after the center opened, when Sarah finally asked me directly about the choice I'd made in the Brooklyn collapse. She was 22 now, graduated from college, working as an art therapist with kids who'd experienced trauma. She understood, in ways she hadn't at 19, the weight of survival and the complexity of healing. "Do you regret it?" she asked during one of our monthly dinners at a small restaurant near her apartment. "Saving me instead of Mrs. Chen?" I considered lying, giving her the answer that would cause the least pain, but Sarah had earned the truth. "Every day," I said, "not because I don't value your life, but because the choice itself was impossible. No one should have to decide who lives and who dies based on a 30-second calculation in a collapsing building." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I dream about her sometimes. Mrs. Chen, I imagine what she was like, what her family was like. I've thought about trying to find them, to say something, but I don't know what I could possibly say." "There's nothing to say," I told her. "Nothing that would bring her back or make the choice less horrible. But there are things you can do. Ways to honor her memory that don't require words." 3 weeks later, Sarah enrolled in my advanced emergency response training. She wanted to learn the skills that might help her save someone else's Mrs. Chen someday. It was her way of carrying the weight, of transforming survival guilt into purposeful action. The center grew steadily. We added programs for adults, for families, for senior citizens who wanted to understand how to help during emergencies, rather than simply wait for help to arrive. We partnered with schools, community organizations, religious congregations. The model was simple: teach people to take care of each other, especially when the systems they relied on failed. Dr. Nash became one of our most vocal supporters, speaking at medical conferences about the importance of civilian emergency preparedness. He'd recovered fully from his heart attack, though he credited the speed of my response with minimizing the long-term damage. His granddaughter Jessica, now 15, had become one of our junior instructors, teaching basic first aid to younger kids with the kind of natural authority that comes from understanding the stakes. On the 3rd anniversary of the Brooklyn collapse, I visited Mrs. Chen's grave for the first time. Her family had buried her in a small cemetery in Queens, under a simple granite headstone that listed her name, dates, and the phrase, "beloved grandmother," in both English and Chinese. I brought flowers, white chrysanthemums, which I'd learned were traditional symbols of mourning and honor in Chinese culture. I stood there for a long time, not praying exactly, but trying to find words for a conversation I'd been having in my head for 3 years. Finally, I spoke aloud. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry you died alone. I'm sorry your family had to bury you because I made a choice that saved my niece instead of you." I paused, watching the wind move through the trees around the cemetery. "But I want you to know that your death wasn't meaningless. Every person I've taught, every life they might save someday. That's your legacy too. You didn't die so Sarah could live. You died because the building fell down and I wasn't fast enough to save everyone. But your death taught me something about the weight of every choice, about the value of every life I touch through my work." I left the flowers and drove back to the center, where my evening class was waiting. 23 adults from across the city, ranging in age from 18 to 74, ready to learn how to stop bleeding, how to recognize signs of stroke, how to evacuate safely when exits are blocked. Simple skills that could mean the difference between life and death when seconds mattered. As I looked out at their faces, eager, nervous, determined, I thought about the strange mathematics of heroism. How saving one life costs another, how living with impossible choices becomes its own kind of strength, how the work of keeping people alive continues long after the cameras stop rolling and the medals are handed out. Mrs. Chen was still dead. Sarah was still alive. And I was still the person who'd made that choice in 30 seconds of smoke and terror. But I was also the person who'd chosen to carry that weight forward, to transform guilt into purpose, to teach others the skills that might help them avoid the impossible choices I'd faced. The class began with introductions, and I listened as each person explained why they were there. A mother whose child had asthma, a college student who'd watched someone collapse on the subway, a retired teacher who wanted to be useful in emergencies, an immigrant who'd survived war and wanted to help his new neighbors prepare for disasters. Each story was a thread in the larger tapestry of survival, of communities that chose to take care of each other instead of waiting for someone else to handle the crisis. This was the real work of heroism, not the dramatic rescues that made headlines, but the quiet preparation that prevented catastrophes, the small acts of knowledge sharing that rippled outward in ways no one could measure. "Tonight," I told the class, "we're going to learn how to save lives, not because you're firefighters or paramedics or doctors, but because you're human beings who share this world with other human beings. And sometimes, the difference between life and death is as simple as knowing what to do and having the courage to act." They leaned forward, ready to learn, and I began to teach them the skills that might someday matter more than anything else they'd ever know. In that moment, in that room full of ordinary people preparing to become extraordinary when it mattered most, I finally understood the true weight of the choice I'd made 3 years ago. Mrs. Chen was gone, but her legacy lived on in every person I taught, in every life they might save, in the endless chain of knowledge and courage that connected us all in our shared vulnerability and strength. It wasn't enough to bring her back, but it was enough to keep moving forward. And sometimes, that's all any of us can do.